The gym was silent, except for the echo of a basketball bouncing against cracked concrete. 5 sneakers were scattered across the court, but their owners were nowhere in sight. The searchlights cut through the midnight fog, voices shouted names, and parents clutched photographs of their missing sons. That night in 1995, 5 high school basketball players vanished without a trace, leaving a town broken and terrified. If you are new to this channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you are watching from. What happened that night was more than just a disappearance. It was the unraveling of dreams, the shattering of families, and the beginning of a mystery that haunted an entire community for years. For 4 long years, there were no answers, just whispers, rumors, and fading hope. Then, in 1999, something turned up. Something so unexpected, it changed everything people thought they knew about the missing players. The summer of 1995 hung heavy with heat, but in that little town, it wasn't the weather that made the air electric. It was basketball. 5 boys, barely out of childhood, carried on their shoulders the weight of a community's pride and the glow of its dreams. They weren't just athletes. They were symbols, living proof that greatness could rise even from cracked sidewalks and makeshift courts. The boys had grown up together, practically inseparable. Their bond was forged in long summer evenings when the sun refused to set and the streets became their playground. With no fancy equipment, they used what they had: faded basketballs, bent rims nailed to telephone poles, and sneakers worn thin from overuse. Sometimes they played barefoot, the soles of their feet blackened by the asphalt. The laughter, the shouts, the endless one-on-one games, it all built something stronger than just skill. It built trust. It built brotherhood. By the time they entered high school, their reputation was already spreading. These weren't just 5 boys who could dribble and shoot. They moved as one, like a machine, anticipating each other's passes before the ball even left their hands. Coaches from rival towns dreaded seeing their names on the schedule, because a matchup against them was more than a game. It was an inevitable defeat. The locals called them the Dream Team. It started as a joke one evening after they'd blown out another rival team, but the nickname stuck. Everyone in town knew who the phrase referred to. They were the heart of Friday nights, the reason gyms filled to capacity, and the spark that turned neighbors into believers. Scouts began to take notice. Whispers about scholarships floated through the stands. The possibility of state championships lingered in every conversation at the diner. Parents who had once thought of basketball as just a pastime now saw it as a golden ticket to something bigger: college, careers, maybe even the NBA for the most talented among them. But beyond the statistics, beyond the scores and trophies, there was something magnetic about them. Each of the 5 had a role that made the team complete. There was the natural leader, whose confidence carried them through impossible comebacks. The sharpshooter who could sink threes from impossible angles. The quiet giant, a center who blocked shots like he was swatting flies. The quick-thinking point guard who turned chaos into order. And the wild card, the one who thrived under pressure, delivering plays that no one saw coming until the ball was already through the net. Together, they weren't just players. They were storytellers, writing chapters of glory on the court with every game, and the town read every word. Yet what truly set them apart wasn't just what happened inside the lines painted on the hardwood. It was how they carried themselves off the court. They volunteered at youth camps, played pickup games with kids who idolized them, and spent long nights at each other's houses, dreaming out loud about their futures. They weren't arrogant or distant. They were local boys, deeply tied to the soil that raised them, and that made their success even sweeter. In many ways, the community invested its hopes in them. People who had never set foot in a gym before now wore jerseys with their numbers. Businesses sponsored games, posting signs that read "Go Dream Team" in shop windows. Elderly men who once grumbled about kids these days found themselves clapping loudly in the stands. The Dream Team was more than a group of athletes. They were a phenomenon, the kind of rare alignment that happens once in a generation. But what no one could have predicted was how quickly that light would dim. For now, in the warmth of 1995, the town was convinced the future was theirs for the taking. Nobody thought about tragedy. Nobody imagined loss. Nobody believed that within months, The laughter of 5 boys who had once played barefoot under streetlights would be silenced, leaving behind nothing but questions. The dream team was destined for greatness. But destiny, as the town would soon learn, had other plans. June 16, 1995. The air inside the gym was electric, thick with the smell of sweat, popcorn, and anticipation. For weeks, the town had waited for this moment. The big tournament. The test that would prove whether the dream team's magic was real or just small-town legend. On one side, the rivals. Bigger, stronger, and determined to put the boys in their place. On the other, 5 young men who had grown up dribbling on cracked sidewalks and shooting hoops until streetlights flickered on. The game was brutal. Every possession was a battle. Every shot contested. Every rebound fought for like survival itself. But as the minutes ticked down, the dream team found their rhythm. The leader barked commands, the point guard darted like lightning, and the sharpshooter's 3-pointers cut through the air like daggers. The crowd roared with every play, rising to its feet as the score tilted in their favor. With seconds left, the scoreboard glowed in triumph. Dream Team 82, Rivals 71. The final buzzer echoed like a victory bell, and in an instant, the gym erupted. Students rushed the court. Parents hugged each other. Strangers high-fived as if they had been friends for years. In the center of it all stood the 5 players, drenched in sweat, their jerseys clinging to them like armor. They were heroes that night. Untouchable, unstoppable, unforgettable. The trophy they lifted wasn't just a piece of metal. It was proof that the town's faith had been justified. But the real celebration came afterward. When the crowd finally thinned, when the gym doors creaked closed and the echo of cheers faded into silence, the 5 boys gathered near the locker room. Their laughter was tired but unstoppable, their words bouncing with the energy of victory. They talked about college scouts who had been spotted in the stands, about state championships that now seemed inevitable, about a future that stretched wide and promising before them. "Tonight, we celebrate," one of them said, slinging an arm around his teammate's shoulder. The others nodded. They had earned it. They left the gym together, still buzzing with adrenaline. Outside, the summer night was warm. The stars scattered like confetti in the sky. Their car, an old but reliable sedan, sat waiting by the curb. Music blasted as soon as the engine roared to life, and the boys piled in, their voices raised in harmony with the radio. Witnesses would later recall seeing them that night. 5 boys in high spirits, windows rolled down, laughter spilling into the darkness. Some said they stopped for food. Others remembered spotting them at a gas station, joking with the clerk. But after that, their trail went cold. As the car disappeared into the night, no one could have known it was the last time they would be seen alive. The hours passed and parents waited. First with patience, then with worry, and finally with dread. Phone calls went unanswered. Curfews were broken. The minutes stretched into hours, the hours into the longest night of their lives. By morning, panic had gripped the town. The dream team, the pride, the hope, the heroes was gone, vanished without a trace. What began as a night of triumph would soon unravel into one of the darkest mysteries the town had ever faced. A victory celebrated by hundreds would be remembered forever, not for the joy it brought, but for the tragedy it hid. The night of June 16, 1995, was supposed to be the beginning of greatness. Instead, it became the end of everything. The morning of June 17, 1995, began like any other in the small town. Sunlight streaking through curtains, coffee brewing in kitchens, and newspapers landing with a thud on porches. But for 5 families, that morning never truly arrived. Their boys, the pride of the community, had not come home. At first, there was denial. Parents assumed their sons had crashed at a friend's house, too exhausted from the victory celebration to bother calling. A few thought maybe they'd stayed out late, still high on adrenaline, grabbing food or sharing laughs until the early hours. But as minutes stretched into hours, unease began to grow. Phone calls started mother to mother, father to coach, neighbor to neighbor, each one carrying the same desperate question: "Have you seen them?" But every answer was the same. No one had seen the boys since they left the gym. By mid-morning, Worry had morphed into full-blown panic. Parents began calling the police, their voices trembling, some sharp with anger, others breaking under the weight of fear. The officers at first urged calm. Teenagers, they reasoned, sometimes slipped away to celebrate, to test their independence, to enjoy freedom on a summer night. But these weren't reckless kids prone to disappearing. They were responsible, close-knit, and loved. Their absence was not only unusual, it was unthinkable. When the boys' car was nowhere to be found, the unease deepened. A search began with a flurry of activity. Police cruisers patrolled the highways, scanning roadsides. Calls went out to nearby towns. Parents retraced the routes they thought the car might have taken. The silence that followed was deafening. By afternoon, the town itself began to stir. Word spread quickly at the diner, at the barbershop, at the gas station. The dream team, the 5 boys who had carried the town's hope on their shoulders, had vanished. The victory from the night before was already fading, replaced with whispers and dread. The families gathered at the police station, their faces pale, eyes red from crying. Mothers clutched photographs, fathers paced, fists clenched in helplessness. Each passing hour without a lead felt like a door closing. That night, the first flyers were printed. Plain white sheets with bold black letters. Missing. 5 players. 1 town's hope. Beneath the headline were their names, their photographs. Smiling faces now frozen in time, looking out from bulletin boards, lampposts, and grocery store windows. Volunteers spread across the town, stapling flyers wherever a pair of eyes might see them. Helicopters were requested. Search parties were organized. The sound of dogs barking in the distance became a reminder that the hunt was on. But with every field scoured, every road checked, the same emptiness awaited. There were no signs of struggle, no tire tracks leading to answers, no footprints to follow, just absence. As night fell for the second time, the weight of uncertainty became unbearable. Parents lay awake, staring at ceilings, praying their sons would walk through the door. Younger siblings cried, confused why their brothers hadn't come home. The town, once so vibrant after victory, now sat in silence, holding its breath. For the first time in years, the basketball court stood empty. The laughter that once echoed through its walls had been replaced by questions that had no answers. The boys were gone, vanished, and though no one knew it yet, the search for them would grow into a mystery that would consume the community for years to come. The disappearance of the dream team turned the town into something unrecognizable. What had been a place of pride and celebration only a day before now became a command post for fear and confusion. Detectives wasted no time. Within hours of the boys being reported missing, the police department was transformed into a hive of frantic activity. Maps were pinned to walls, phone lines rang constantly, and officers moved in and out with clipped urgency. Roads leading out of town were the first priority. Patrol cars traced every mile, searching ditches and wooded edges for signs of a crash. Nothing. Helicopters soon joined in, slicing through the summer sky, their blades rattling as spotlights swept over fields and rivers. Residents gathered outside their homes to watch, shielding their eyes from the glare, hoping the lights might find what human eyes had missed. Detectives expanded the search to abandoned buildings on the outskirts of town. Old warehouses, barns left to rot, and shuttered motels. All were pried open, their dark corners searched for any sign of the boys. Volunteers, neighbors, teachers, classmates formed search parties and trudged through knee-high grass, scouring fields and forest trails. They carried flashlights, ropes, and an unspoken hope that maybe the players had simply gotten lost. But as the hours turned into days, no trace appeared. Not a scrap of clothing, not a tire mark, not even a discarded soda cup. The car remained missing, and with it, any logical explanation. Rumors began to spread, as they always do when fear outpaces facts. Some whispered the boys had run away, choosing adventure over responsibility. But that theory never sat well. These weren't kids planning escapes. They were kids with futures laid out before them. Scholarships, championships. Why would they vanish on the cusp of everything they had worked for? Others pointed fingers at rival towns, places they had beaten on the court with such dominance that resentment surely lingered. Could bitterness have boiled over into something sinister? Had jealous enemies taken revenge? It was a theory that caught fire quickly, stoking old rivalries and breeding suspicion. And then there were the darker theories. People spoke in hushed tones about shadows that lurked in rural highways, strangers who preyed on the unsuspecting. Stories of vans without license plates, of unfamiliar faces seen at gas stations, of headlights that trailed too close on empty country roads. Each rumor grew in the telling, feeding the town's paranoia. The detectives, though, tried to cut through the noise. They interviewed the last people who had seen the boys alive. Teammates, classmates, the janitor who had closed the gym, the cashier at the diner where they were rumored to have stopped. Every account seemed to lead nowhere, every memory blurred by time and the chaos of that triumphant night. Meanwhile, the families clung to the search with desperate energy. Fathers stomped through fields with flashlights, refusing to rest. Mothers prayed aloud as they handed out flyers, their hands trembling as they taped posters to every surface they could find. The town became wallpapered with the boys' faces, each smiling portrait a cruel reminder of their absence. The search lasted days, then weeks. Search parties grew smaller as exhaustion set in, but the families refused to quit. Detectives rotated shifts, but every officer knew the same grim truth. The longer someone is missing, the less likely they are to be found alive. It was a reality no one dared speak aloud, not in front of the parents. By the end of that first week, the mood in the town had shifted from determination to dread. Every passing helicopter, every barking search dog, every knock at the door carried with it the same unbearable weight. Would this be the moment we finally find them, or the moment we realize we never will? The dream team was gone, and the search was beginning to feel like chasing ghosts. As the days turned into weeks, the search for the dream team began to shift. The initial wave of urgency, the helicopters, the search parties, the constant patrols, slowly gave way to something harder to pin down: whispers. Stories drifted through the town like smoke, impossible to catch and impossible to ignore. The first came from a gas station clerk. He swore he had seen the boys on the night of June 16th, pulling up in their sedan just past midnight. According to him, they weren't alone. He described a black pickup truck parked nearby, its engine idling, its driver leaning against the hood. The clerk claimed he saw the boys exchange words with the man. Tense words, maybe even an argument. Something wasn't right, he muttered to detectives, his eyes shifting nervously as if the memory itself frightened him. But when pressed for details, what the man looked like, what was said, his story unraveled. Sometimes the driver was tall, other times short. Sometimes he wore a hat, sometimes he didn't. Still, the image of that black pickup burned itself into the town's imagination. Then came the waitress. She told investigators she had served the boys' burgers that same night, at a diner along the highway. They had been laughing, full of energy, celebrating their victory just hours before. But when the plates were cleared and the check was left on the table, they never returned. To her, it was odd. She remembered them leaving together, stepping into the night, but no headlights ever pulled away. It was like they vanished into thin air, she said. Yet the diner's old security cameras had long been broken, and no one else remembered seeing them there. Other stories followed, each more unsettling than the last. A trucker swore he'd seen the sedan speeding down a rural highway, chased by another vehicle. A teenager claimed to have overheard voices in the woods, 5 boys yelling for help, though no footprints were ever found. An elderly couple reported seeing figures at the edge of their property late that night, standing silently before disappearing into the trees. For the detectives, each lead was both a promise and a curse. They chased down every tip, every rumor, only to hit walls of contradiction. Witnesses contradicted each other. Timelines overlapped in impossible ways. What seemed like breakthroughs dissolved into smoke. Yet the whispers did something else. They fueled the town's imagination. Soon, speculation ran rampant. Some residents were certain the boys had been kidnapped. Others believed they had stumbled into something far darker. Drugs, crime, or a secret someone wanted buried. Theories sprouted in diners, on front porches, in hushed conversations at church pews. And always woven through them was the fear that someone in town knew more than they were saying. The families clung to each rumor with desperate hope. A black pickup? Maybe the police would find it. A diner sighting? Maybe the boys had made it that far. But each time the lead collapsed, the crash of disappointment grew heavier. Detectives tried to keep the investigation steady, but even they weren't immune. "We're chasing ghosts," one officer admitted after yet another dead end. Files stacked higher on desks, each folder a record of possibility that had gone nowhere. The truth was slipping further away, buried beneath layers of shadows and speculation. The boys were still missing. The car was still missing. And now, the town itself was beginning to fracture under the weight of unanswered questions. In the end, all that remained were whispers, fragments of a night that refused to make sense, hints of a story half told. And somewhere in that fog of rumor and fear, the truth was waiting. But for now, it stayed hidden just out of reach. The first few weeks after the boys' disappearance were filled with sleepless nights, endless phone calls, and prayers whispered into the silence. Every ringing phone sparked hope. Every knock at the door made hearts leap. But as days stretched into weeks and weeks blurred into months, the once steady rhythm of waiting began to wear down the families. Grief didn't arrive like a storm. It seeped in quietly, dripping through the cracks of daily life until it consumed everything. At first, parents held each other together. They gathered in living rooms, sharing coffee and stories about their sons, promising to stay strong. But unity frayed as time passed. Some parents pushed tirelessly for new searches, new posters, new pleas to the media. Others pulled inward, worn down by the weight of unanswered questions. What had started as a community of support slowly turned into fragmented islands of grief. For some, hope became a lifeline. Every holiday, they set an extra plate at the table, an unspoken invitation for their missing child to come home. Birthdays were celebrated with cake and candles, photos propped up in place of the boys who should have been there. These rituals were not about acceptance but resistance, tiny acts of defiance against despair. Mothers clutched their sons' old jerseys. Fathers left porch lights on through the night, all clinging to the fragile belief that miracles still happened. For others, the weight of absence became unbearable. Fathers who once carried themselves with quiet strength found themselves drinking late into the night, searching for solace at the bottom of a bottle. Marriages buckled under the pressure, some ending in silence, others in shouting matches that echoed down hallways. Siblings, once close, now grew resentful. How could they compete with a ghost who commanded so much of their parents' attention? The town itself reflected the fracture. Where once the missing boys were the center of every conversation, eventually fatigue set in. Neighbors grew weary of whispered theories and unanswered questions. Some wanted to move on, to stop living under the shadow of loss. Others refused, determined to keep the boys' names alive no matter the cost. This division left scars, not only within families but across the entire community. Grief left strange marks on everyday life. One mother kept her son's bedroom untouched, dusting the shelves weekly, smoothing his unmade bed as though he might walk in at any moment. Another father refused to attend town gatherings, convinced the community hadn't done enough in the search. Some families found faith, kneeling in church pews week after week, while others abandoned it altogether, bitter at a God who had let their children vanish without explanation. Years passed, and the silence grew heavier. Fresh missing person cases surfaced, drawing away media attention. New families moved into town, unaware of the tragedy that still haunted its streets. For the parents, however, time didn't soften the blow. It deepened it. The hope that once kept them breathing began to feel like a cruel weight, dragging them deeper into despair. And yet, through all the cracks and broken pieces, the families were bound by the same unanswerable question. What happened that night? Until the truth was uncovered, closure remained an unreachable dream. Some families waited for a call that never came. Others stopped waiting altogether, choosing instead to let go. The tragedy was no longer just about 5 missing boys. It had become a shadow that lingered in kitchens, at empty dinner tables, and in the hearts of those left behind. The boys had vanished, but so too had the lives their families once knew. By 1999, silence had replaced the storm. The frantic searches, the flashing lights, the constant updates on the evening news. Those were long gone. What remained was a cold case file buried in a cabinet at the sheriff's office, growing heavier with every year it sat untouched. The boys' faces, once bright on flyers taped to telephone poles and store windows, had faded to ghostly outlines. The ink had run from rain and sun, until only fragments of smiles and names could be seen. The trophies that had once represented the town's pride now sat gathering dust in the high school gymnasium's glass case. No one polished them anymore. The once shining basketballs dulled, the plaques tarnished. Students who had idolized the missing players moved on, graduating, leaving town, carrying with them only a faint memory of the tragedy. For the younger generation, the story became something whispered in hallways, an eerie cautionary tale told by older siblings. Detectives had hit wall after wall. Leads had dried up, tips stopped coming. Eventually, even the investigators themselves stopped calling the families with updates. There was nothing left to say. The case hadn't been closed, but it might as well have been. In the sheriff's office, the folder was labeled with 2 words: cold case. For the families, those words cut deeper than a knife. It wasn't closure, it was abandonment. 4 years is a long time to live with silence. For some parents, the uncertainty had eroded every ounce of energy they once had. Their faces aged far beyond their years, eyes carrying the weight of nights spent crying into pillows or staring at empty driveways. Others tried to stitch life back together. They returned to work, forced smiles at social gatherings, but beneath the surface, the wound never healed. Every laugh felt guilty. Every moment of peace felt stolen. The town itself began to forget. New scandals, new tragedies, new victories filled the air. Life moved on, as it always does. But for those who had lost their sons, moving on wasn't an option. They were stuck in the same moment, the night the boys vanished, like a broken record that refused to stop playing. Then, just as the shadows threatened to smother the last flickers of memory, something stirred. It came quietly, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. A farmer digging in a remote field unearthed something strange. A hiker, wandering deep into the woods, stumbled upon something he couldn't explain. A rumor began to spread. A whisper that maybe, just maybe, the boys hadn't simply vanished. No one knew exactly what had been found at first. The sheriff's office stayed silent, fueling speculation. But whispers leaked through the cracks. Something buried, something hidden all these years. The weight of secrecy pressed down on the town once again. Was it evidence? A car? Remains? No one dared to speak the words aloud, but everyone thought them. Families who had stopped answering calls now sat by their phones again. Neighbors eyed each other suspiciously, wondering if someone in town had known the truth all along. Fear and curiosity rekindled old wounds. After 4 years of silence, the case wasn't just a memory. It was alive again, clawing its way back into the light. The posters might have faded, the trophies might have collected dust, but the truth had not disappeared. It had only been buried, waiting. And now, in 1999, that truth was finally starting to surface. The woods were dense, the kind of place where sunlight filtered through in broken shards, barely touching the forest floor. Most locals didn't wander this far. The terrain was rough, filled with thorny underbrush and uneven slopes that seemed to lead nowhere. But on a cool spring morning in 1999, 2 hikers decided to take a trail that had long been forgotten. Its markers faded, its path nearly erased by time. What they stumbled upon that day would shake the town to its core. At first, it was just a glint of metal, dull, almost hidden by vines and leaves. They might have ignored it, brushed it off as an old tractor part left to rot in the woods. But curiosity pulled them closer. As they pushed through the branches, they realized what they were looking at wasn't scrap metal. It was the back bumper of a car, its once bright paint now flaking and rusted to the bone. The forest had swallowed it whole. The hikers froze. The air seemed heavier, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. One of them took a cautious step forward, brushing aside layers of ivy. The outline of a vehicle slowly came into view. Doors caved in, glass shattered, tires sunken into the earth. A car abandoned, hidden, forgotten. Yet there was something about it, something that sent a shiver crawling up their spines. They circled the wreck, and that's when they saw the license plate. The numbers were faded, but still legible. Recognition struck like lightning. This wasn't just any car. It was the car, the one the 5 boys had driven away in the night they disappeared. The hikers exchanged a look, wide-eyed, their throats dry. For 4 years, the town had asked where the boys had gone. Now the woods had given them an answer. The discovery didn't stop with the car itself. Inside the crumpled frame, beneath shattered glass and a thick blanket of leaves, were remnants of the players' lives, objects that spoke louder than words. 5 basketball jerseys lay in a heap, torn and weathered by time, but unmistakable. The numbers, though faint, were still visible. Each one belonged to one of the boys. Once worn with pride under Friday night lights, the fabric was now stained and silent, holding secrets no one could yet explain. The hikers didn't touch anything. They couldn't. Fear kept them rooted to the spot. Instead, they backed away slowly, hearts pounding, before rushing down the trail to find someone, anyone to tell. By nightfall, news of the wreck spread across town like wildfire. Police swarmed the area, sealing it off with tape and floodlights. Reporters arrived, their cameras flickering in the darkness. Parents who had waited for long years stood outside the cordon, trembling, desperate for answers, terrified of what they might finally learn. Inside the wreck, investigators worked carefully, peeling back layers of decay. Every detail felt heavy with meaning. A cracked wristwatch still frozen at a certain time, a sneaker wedged beneath the gas pedal, scraps of paper barely legible. The jerseys especially told a story of their own, a cruel reminder that these were not just 5 players but 5 lives cut short. For the town, the wreck's discovery was both a revelation and a nightmare. It confirmed what many had feared. The boys hadn't run away, hadn't left by choice. Something had happened out there in the woods, something dark enough to bury both a car and a town's hope. The unanswered questions, however, only grew louder. How had the car ended up so far off the beaten path? Why hadn't search teams found it years earlier? And most of all, what had really happened inside that rusted shell, deep in the shadows of the trees? The wreck was not closure. It was the beginning of a new storm. The forest was alive with movement the morning after the discovery. Red and blue lights pulsed against the trees, casting strange shadows across the undergrowth. Police cars lined the narrow dirt road, and officers wove in and out of the brush with grim determination. Forensic vans parked at the edge of the clearing, their back doors open, equipment spilling out as technicians hurried to the wreck. The scene felt unreal, like a movie set, but there was nothing scripted about the rusted skeleton of the car lying at the bottom of the ravine. For years, it had sat there, just yards from a forgotten logging road, hidden beneath layers of leaves, branches, and time itself. Search teams had combed the highways, drained lakes, questioned strangers, and chased rumors in distant towns. But somehow they had missed this. 5 boys, trapped in plain sight, just miles from home. Detectives stood shoulder to shoulder at the ravine's edge, staring down at the wreck. Even the most seasoned officers felt their stomachs twist. They had sworn to the families that they would find answers. Now, staring at the crumpled car, they realized the answers had been here all along, waiting to be uncovered. When forensic teams descended into the ravine, the silence was deafening. Cameras clicked, gloves rustled. Every movement carried the weight of finality. Inside the car, they found fragments of a story written in metal and bone. The steering wheel was bent inward, glass shattered across the seats. The roof had caved in from the force of the crash. This wasn't an accident that left room for escape. It was violent, merciless, and instantaneous. Then came the jerseys. 5 of them, stained and torn, but still recognizable. Technicians laid them carefully on plastic sheets, cataloging each one. The numbers matched the missing boys. To the officers watching, it felt like a punch to the chest. These weren't just pieces of fabric. They were symbols of lives once filled with promise, dreams of scholarships, championships, futures that would never be. Nearby, a pair of sneakers still clung to the pedals, the laces tangled in the rust. A cracked wristwatch lay on the floorboard, its hands frozen at a precise moment in time. 12:47 a.m. Had that been the second the car careened off the logging road? Or had it stopped later, its battery drained in silence? Investigators scribbled notes, their minds racing with possibilities. The official theory came together quickly. The boys had been celebrating that night, riding high on their tournament victory. They had taken the wrong road in the dark, perhaps chasing shortcuts, perhaps simply lost. The car, speeding down a trail meant for heavy trucks, had veered off the edge of a hidden ravine. It tumbled down out of sight, swallowed by the woods. It was the simplest answer, tragic, devastating, but logical. Yet simplicity didn't soothe the families. For them, the revelation was unbearable. For 4 years, they had left porch lights on, prayed for phone calls, waited for a knock on the door. For 4 years, their sons had been no more than a half-hour drive away, unseen beneath the trees. The thought was cruel beyond measure. Word of the discovery spread quickly, igniting shockwaves beyond the town. News stations broadcast the story, interviews filled the air, and people across the state whispered about how something so horrific could go unnoticed for so long. Critics pointed fingers at law enforcement. How had search teams missed this? How had cadaver dogs, helicopters, and volunteers passed so close yet failed to find the wreck? The questions mounted, each one heavier than the last. But amid the outrage and sorrow, one truth stood firm. The boy's story was no longer a mystery of vanishing. It was now a story of a tragic crash, hidden by time and terrain. A story of lives lost not in some faraway place, but right in the heart of the woods they had all grown up knowing. The shock was total. The answers were devastating. But deep down, a chilling question lingered. Was it really an accident? Or was there more to this discovery than met the eye? For a brief moment, the discovery of the car seemed to provide closure. The families finally had an answer, however painful. The boys hadn't run away, hadn't been abducted by strangers in some distant town. They had been here, victims of a crash lost to the woods. But as the first wave of shock settled, questions began bubbling to the surface. Questions that refused to be silenced. How could an entire vehicle vanish for 4 years without a trace? Search teams had combed these woods back in 1995, or at least they thought they had. Helicopters had flown overhead, their spotlights sweeping the forest floor. Volunteers with dogs had trekked through ravines, lakes, and fields. If the car had been here the entire time, how had every one of them missed it? Detectives walked the logging road again, tracing the path to the ravine. It wasn't hidden. It was right there, a few hundred feet from the overgrown trail. Yes, the road was rough, and yes, the forest grew thick with vines and branches, but should that have been enough to conceal a crash site with 5 passengers? The explanation felt thin. And then there were the tire tracks. Forensic analysts studying the soil around the ravine noticed impressions, faint but undeniable. They didn't match the missing boy's car. These tracks belonged to something bigger, heavier. A truck, maybe. Or a pickup. The marks were old, weather-worn, but they suggested one chilling possibility. Another vehicle had been there that night. The theory of a simple accident began to unravel. If the boy's car had veered off the road, why were there traces of another vehicle nearby? Had they been run off the path? Had someone followed them? The discovery raised the specter of foul play, a possibility that reopened wounds the families had barely begun to confront. Parents demanded answers at town hall meetings. Some insisted it was negligence. How could police miss the car for so long? Others whispered darker theories. Perhaps someone hadn't wanted the car found. Perhaps the crash hadn't been an accident at all. The image of the boys arguing with a stranger at the gas station, the rumor that had circulated years earlier, suddenly felt less like idle gossip and more like a missing piece of the puzzle. Reporters latched onto the controversy, spinning headlines that questioned the competence of the investigation. Television anchors asked on air, "Did law enforcement overlook foul play?" Rumors grew with each passing day, fueled by every new inconsistency. The frozen wristwatch stopped at 12:47 a.m. Was that the time of the crash, or had something else caused it to break? And why were the jerseys found neatly folded in the back seat, rather than strewn around the wreck as one might expect in a violent accident? Even the families couldn't agree. Some clung to the accident theory, as painful as it was, because it offered closure. Others could not accept it. To them, the idea that their sons had simply missed a turn felt insulting, too ordinary for such an extraordinary loss. They needed answers that made sense of the impossible. Detectives reopened the case files, dusting off old witness statements. They revisited the gas station clerk, the waitress, anyone who had seen the boys that night. Every rumor suddenly seemed worth chasing again. And as they sifted through the evidence, one truth became increasingly clear. The story wasn't over. The wreck explained where the boys had been for 4 years, but it didn't explain how they ended up there, or why no one had found them sooner. Until those questions were answered, the shadow of doubt would linger, dark and suffocating, over the entire town. And as investigators leaned closer to the evidence, one chilling thought echoed in everyone's mind. Accidents don't usually leave this many unanswered questions. When word of the discovery spread, the town was thrust into mourning all over again. For years, the absence of the 5 boys had hung in the air like an open wound. Now, the wreck's discovery reopened that wound, rawer than before. The hope that had once flickered stubbornly in porch lights left on overnight was finally extinguished. The funerals were unlike anything the town had seen before. Black ribbons lined Main Street. Banners once painted with cheers for basketball games now bore the boys' names in solemn remembrance. 5 hearses moved slowly through the streets, one after another, a grim procession that silenced even the youngest children. Entire classrooms attended, teachers guiding students in hushed tones, while townspeople lined the sidewalks in heavy silence. Inside the church, the jerseys told their own story. Each coffin bore the faded uniform of its player, carefully laid across the polished wood. Numbers that had once brought the crowd to its feet now reduced grown men and women to tears. Pastors spoke of promise, of faith, of lives cut short, but every word seemed to fall flat under the weight of the tragedy. Parents clutched each other in the pews, trembling with grief. Friends wept openly, remembering the laughter that used to echo down the school's hallways. Yet grief was not the only emotion present. Anger simmered beneath the mourning, a restless undercurrent that could not be ignored. For 4 years, the families had waited, begged, and pleaded for answers. They had searched fields, knocked on doors, plastered flyers across the state. And all that time, their sons had been lying just miles away, hidden but not invisible. How had no one found them? How had search teams missed the wreck? In whispered conversations outside the church and at candlelight vigils, the same words repeated over and over. This doesn't make sense. Townsfolk who had once trusted the authorities now doubted them. Some believed incompetence had stolen those years of closure. Others whispered something darker, that someone had known, that someone had buried the truth. The anger grew louder at community meetings. Parents demanded accountability. "We trusted you," one mother cried, her voice shaking with fury at the sheriff's department. "For 4 years, we trusted you to bring our boys home, and they were here all along. You failed us." The sheriff, gray and worn, stood at the front of the room with nothing but silence for an answer. The younger generation, those who had once idolized the boys, turned their grief into outrage. They spray-painted questions on abandoned walls. Who knew? Who hid this? For them, the loss wasn't just about the players, it was about faith in the people meant to protect them. And still, rumors spread like wildfire. The gas station sighting, the waitress's story, the mysterious black pickup truck, all resurfaced, no longer dismissed as gossip. With the wreck discovered, everything felt possible again. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Some swore they had seen strange lights in the woods that night. Others claimed there were men in uniforms who kept them away from certain areas during the search. Each story, true or not, added to the firestorm of suspicion. The funerals ended, the coffins lowered into the ground, but the town did not heal. Instead, it divided. Those who believed in the accident theory clung to it, desperate for peace. Those who believed in foul play could not let it go, their anger hardening into obsession. For the families, closure was still an illusion. The graves gave them a place to lay flowers, yes, but not the answers they needed. As one father said, standing at his son's burial site, "We may have found them, but we still don't know why." The town mourned, the town raged, and in the silence that followed, a haunting realization lingered. The story of the 5 boys wasn't finished. It had only shifted from a tale of disappearance to a tale of betrayal. The discovery of the wreck and the funerals that followed closed one chapter of the story, but opened another that no one in town could ignore. For years, the boys had existed in the fragile space between hope and despair. Missing, but not confirmed gone. Their absence had fueled dreams of miraculous returns, whispers of abductions, and desperate prayers. But once the car was found, the truth settled like dust after a storm. They weren't coming back. And yet, the discovery didn't bring peace. It brought transformation. The 5 players were no longer remembered only as athletes or classmates. Their names became etched into the very identity of the town. Murals of their faces appeared on the side of the high school gym, painted by volunteers who wanted the world to remember them as they had been. Grinning, alive, full of promise. The gym where they had once electrified crowds now bore a plaque with their names engraved. A permanent reminder that they had been more than just players. They had been hope itself. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, the town gathered. Candles were lit, basketballs laid at the steps of the school, and stories retold of the boys' laughter, their victories, their dreams. Parents spoke of empty chairs at the dinner table, of birthdays never celebrated, of futures erased. Teachers shared how the boys had inspired others to aim higher, to dream bigger, to work harder. But beneath the tears and tributes, an unspoken tension always lingered, the questions that had never been answered. Because the discovery, as shocking as it had been, hadn't resolved everything. How had no one found them for 4 years? What about the second set of tire tracks near the ravine? Why had their jerseys been folded neatly in the car, as if placed there deliberately? The official report called it an accident, the result of young men celebrating recklessly, taking a wrong road, and paying the ultimate price. But not everyone believed that. Not everyone could. The town was split in two. For some, accepting the accident theory was the only way to heal. To them, lingering on suspicions was a prison they refused to enter. But for others, the doubts became an obsession. They pored over maps, interviewed old witnesses, searched the woods themselves, convinced that someone had pushed the boys off the road, or that someone had covered it up. These factions never clashed openly, but the quiet divide shaped conversations at church, at grocery stores, and at family dinners. The tragedy had not only stolen 5 lives, it had fractured the town's trust. Still, the boys remained a symbol, both of unity and of loss. Their story was taught to every new generation, not as a cautionary tale alone, but as a reminder of fleeting youth and fragile dreams. For the kids who now wore the high school jerseys, stepping onto the basketball court was more than a game, it was a responsibility. They weren't just playing for themselves. They were carrying the legacy of those who never got the chance to fulfill theirs. Over time, the raw grief softened, but it never disappeared. Parents still visited the graves, some speaking aloud to the headstones as though the boys might answer back. Others avoided the cemetery altogether, unable to face the finality carved into stone. But whether spoken or silent, the grief remained a constant presence, shaping the town's identity for decades to come. Even as the case faded into the yellowed pages of history books, one truth remained unshakable. The night of June 16, 1995, would haunt the town forever. The boys were no longer missing, but neither were they fully found. They had become something larger than life, a mixture of heroes and ghosts, hope and tragedy, memory and mystery. And in the end, their absence spoke louder than their presence ever had.